This is Robert Redford. 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 And this is a video on the Robert Redford Effect. Robert Redford is dead, and I'm sad. I should make a Robert Redford video. I should watch a Robert Redford film. I should watch a few Robert Redford films. Then the question is, what to watch? Where to start? Maybe Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, the role that made him star. Maybe that cool Tony Scott film he made with Brad Pitt, which I've only half ever seen. Or maybe his most iconic film, All the President's Men. I've seen it a million times. Why not once more? One thing's for sure, it's time to update my letterboxd, like a lot. I don't really know where to start, so over about 10 days, I honestly just begin picking a few at random, most of which I've never seen before. So Robert Redford became the very definition of the American leading man in the second half of the 20th century. In an era where maybe you could say good looks mattered less than like acting chops, Redford always stood out, even to me, at least to me, with his like blonde hair and blue eyes. I always felt he represented more somewhat the lost innocence of the 1950s. So yeah, over the course of his career, Redford made some of the most definitive classics across some of the most definitive of American genres. So in the Western, he made Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. In the sports genre, he made one of the most iconic and mythic baseball films ever with The Natural. He made his prison movie with The Last Castle. He made his disaster movie with All Is Lost. But maybe what he became most famous for is the political thriller, and in an era defined by Watergate in the early to mid 70s, as Redford was coming into his prime. This obviously makes a lot of sense. And within that genre, he made kind of some of his most famous films of all time, including Sneakers, Spy Game, and his most famous film, All the President's Men. So his performances also didn't immediately necessarily call attention themselves. The late 60s and early 70s were very much the era of the angry man, but in an era defined by changing values and anger and war. Redford was always the quietest of leading men. I can't even think, honestly, of a scene where he raised his voice in all his films. Redford was more, more internal than external. And in many ways, his performances, and maybe even his movies, you could say, have more in common with, say, Clint Eastwood than his maybe more contemporaries like Pacino or Betty or De Niro. But as I watch more and more Robert Redford films, I find myself thinking more and more about Robert Redford. And it occurs to me that there is another kind of Redford film, the smaller kind of films that he championed and helped platform through his Sundance Film Festival. Films such as Before Sunrise, Reservoir Dogs, and Sex, Lies and Videotape. Aren't these in a way kind of like Robert Redford films too? But where do these films fit in? So before we talk about Sundance, it might make sense to wonder where the seeds of Sundance actually begun. And you know what? Maybe the Academy Awards of 1976 are actually as good a guess as any. So when Rocky won Best Picture over All the President's Men in 1976, maybe Redford simply saw the writing on the wall, as it does seem to somewhat mark a split between him and the mainstream cinema. And he wasn't incorrect, you know what I mean? The following year, Star Wars would become the biggest box office hit of all time. And then as the 70s turned into the 80s, and films such as Ghostbusters, Top Gun, and Aliens began to dominate the American film landscape, Redford simply began to move his gaze elsewhere. So if Rocky was Hollywood's answer to the 1970s and All the President's Men, then maybe Ordinary People is Redford's reply to that. You know, Ordinary People is a film that's massively at odds with the times, and it is really in some ways the first kind of Sundance film, a prototype film for the kind of films that the festival was going to platform and champion And I also think this period of Redford's career is kind of a good example of how he gets misinterpreted by different audiences. Ordinary People always gets kind of a hard time because it beat Raging Bull that year at the Academy Awards to win Best Picture. So the art house crowd always kind of looked down on Ordinary People. But it's important to remember that it was still a film at odds with the time, and very much at odds with what Hollywood was fast becoming, churning out films like, Superman and Alien. So Ordinary People is very much a film at odds with that. It's an intimate character drama that casts people against type. Even Raging Bull is much more of its time than Ordinary People, and much more of a showy film in terms of the visual flourishes that Scorsese brings to it, compared with the more nuanced filmmaking, you could call it, that Redford brings to Ordinary People. But Redford didn't just want to act or direct, he wanted to build infrastructure for new voices. In the mountains of Utah, he created a space for filmmakers to experiment. The Sundance Institute hosted labs where filmmakers could work with mentors, refine scripts, and learn the craft. And a few years later, the Sundance Film Festival was born. At first it was tiny, just a handful of films screened for small audiences, but soon it became the place where independent cinema found its voice. Throughout the 1980s, Sundance platformed a series of lower-budget, character-focused films. Soldier Girls is a very early Nick Broomfield effort that won the Grand Jury Prize for documentary in 1981. It was a documentary focusing on a number of women training in the army. In 1985, two unknown brothers won the Grand Jury Prize for a film called Blood Simple. Their names were the Quain brothers. In 1988, a film called Heat and Sunlight won the Dramatic Grand Jury Prize, and this was a smaller, intimate film about two people simply trying to repair a relationship. So these kind of films were not in the mainstream consciousness at all, obviously, but Redford and his team helped to give them a platform, a launchpad, and I guess what made Sundance different was its philosophy. Redford emphasized authenticity over polish, passion over spectacle, and this was again at odds with what Hollywood was doing at the time. But the film championed low-budget films with big ideas, so stories about outsiders, families, politics, identity, and survival. And audiences embraced it, and the film festival began to grow, and studios began to look at Sundance for the quote-unquote next big thing. And suddenly the films that they were screening weren't just niche, they were winning Oscars and influencing the culture. And I guess behind it all, you could say Redford was staying focused on the idea that art thrives when you give people space to take risks. Crucially, I think the difference is in Sundance is that they didn't just show films, they also supported the filmmakers through developing scripts and workshops with the Sundance Institute. So a good example is Quentin Tarantino and Reservoir Dogs. He was given the mentor of Terry Gilliam to help develop the script, and I know that Tarantino has gone on the record to say how helpful this process was. And then the breakthrough for the film festival would come in 1989 with the release of Sex, Lies and Videotape. And so finally I take a break from the Redford filmography. Where to begin, what to watch, what matters. I forget about all that for a while and watch one of my favourite indie films of all time, Sex, Lies and Videotape. So the film is still lauded today for showing the stark truth of the filmmaker's struggles with intimacy and being vulnerable. It also stands the test of time as a piece of cinema that resonates deeply with viewers who are struggling with the same issues that can ultimately, make or break a relationship and prevent us from living life to the fullest. The film was also a tonic to the blockbuster films of the 1980s. It was a dark film that forced us to look inward. And like every indie filmmaker, I would love to make a film like this, a film that is so deep, so dramatic, so introspective, has so much to say. It really boggles my mind how Soderbergh was able to make this when he was 26 or 27, whatever he was. It just seems almost impossible. And Sundance would continue to promote that kind of film. And the following year, the winner of the Audience Award, the same award that Sex, Lies and Videotape had won, was a film called Longtime Companion. And that brought the issue of AIDS forward to a mainstream audience, years before more mainstream Hollywood films would bring it to audiences in films like Philadelphia. So Redford matters because he basically spent his whole career proving that cinema was, at its most powerful when it was telling intimate stories about characters that felt real and were in real locations. And I feel like today we're in a little bit of a similar situation to the late 1980s, where mainstream cinema feels a little bit like it's lost its way and directionless, and maybe has lost touch with the mainstream masses. I think cinema needs to remember the lessons of Robert Redford. Cinema needs original voices to rejuvenate itself and to keep itself relevant, to a new generation of cinema goers and filmmakers.